Okay, so anyway, here we go. And this was put together basically to educate municipalities on, and, remember me saying earlier that the procurement program was designed so that it's self-sufficient, and trying to educate industries on how they can recoup some of the money, or cities on how they can recoup some of the money for running their procurement programs. And the unfortunate fact is that some of the smaller towns, where you have one industry that has all the jobs, that they're going to bend over backwards to let that industry stay in town and keep the jobs. But in theory, the industry should be paying for it. It's really unfortunate when the ratepayers have to pay those high sewer bills and water bills to keep industries in town. So there's a number of mechanisms that cities have in place. And the first thing we tell them is to make sure that they've got the legal authority to collect fees, to issue permit fees and inspection fees, and to recoup fees from their industries. And the other thing too is, even if they modify their sewer ordinance so that they can collect these fees, we also encourage them to look through other legal documents, city charters and so forth, because we've run into issues where they've had other ordinances pop up that there may be an old city charter that's 50 or 60 years old that has a statement in there that bans them from charging anybody more than $50 for any services that are provided. And you don't want to end up with two different legal documents that are conflicting with one another. So we want to do a very thorough legal review. So these are just some of the mechanisms for which they can collect funding that help support the procurement program. And we'll talk about all these in a little bit more detail. But it's all essentially about cost recovery. Surcharges, wastewater surcharges is the primary way that industries can recoup cost. Charging for the excess treatment, of VOD, suspended solids, and other conventional pollutants. And there's a University in Memphis professor that used to travel around with me teaching, and I'm constantly preaching about how things need to be treated on site at the industry, and he's preaching that all the waste should be sent to the city wastewater plant for them to treat. So we're battling back and forth. But for conventional pollutants, there is some rationale for, as long as the city's wastewater plant has the capacity and can treat it, why not treat it for the industry and charge them a surcharge rate and get that money back out of it? And it works well, because that way, you don't have to worry about them, are they treating their waste properly? Because if they're not, then that's really cause problems for your operator, whereas if you're getting it all and they're just paying for the excess treatment cost, then the city has complete control over that. And we had a dairy processor in Middle Tennessee that was right next to the wastewater plant, and they had an elaborate treatment system in place. But the city's wastewater operator called the industry because they were low on BOD, and he said, "You know what? We can take all your waste. You can shut your treatment system off." He shut his treatment system off. 24 hours later, the plant was upset, and there were fish killed in the receiving stream because they weren't prepared to take all that waste, because it wasn't something they normally do. So. But they certainly can treat it, and again, it makes sense, and it helps the city recoup money. And I was telling somebody earlier that we had one industrial laundry that, because of their high volume water usage and the surcharge that they paid for this at the city, their surcharge rate funded the city's maintenance on their sewer plant, their water plant, their distribution system, and their collection system, all from that one industry. Here's an example where you got a wastewater plant, and they're exceeding their design capacity. They have violations of BOD, ammonia, and suspended solids, and they do have a surcharge program in place. And the plant's expanding, and they're expecting to do expansion in 2 years. So, the question is, what should the wastewater plant do? Because they've got a surcharge program in place, they should be recouping costs for treating this high-strength waste, but they're still having a violation. So there's a couple of things that we have to ask ourselves. And one is, can they identify the source of these high-strength waste, and is it somebody that they're actually surcharging? If not, they need to go out and get a better control over who that's coming from. And the second is their design capacity actually accurate? One of the things that we find is that engineers can, we were talking to last week, that their wastewater plant was operating at a much higher efficiency than what the design was set for. And a lot of times as regulators, we look at it and go, wow, they're approaching 85 or 90% of their design capacity. They've got to do an expansion when in reality, if the operators can show you that they can operate that plant more efficiently, then really their design capacity is much higher. And all they have to do is do a re-engineering study and submit that to the state for approval, and they can raise that design rate. But in this issue, they're having MPDS violations, so the bigger thing is going and identifying what the source of that, what the source of their loading is, and if there's something that's already regulating. And the other thing is, just because you have a surcharge program in place, doesn't necessarily ensure that you're always going to be able to meet MPDS limits. And that's why we recommend that cities have, in addition to a surcharge level, that they have an upper limit for BODs that's been installed and their other surcharge parameters, so that when an industry reaches that loading or that concentration, that they are in violation, just like any other permit limit, they would be treated as a violation in addition to the surcharge that they paid. For example, you may start surcharging an industry at BOD above 300 milligrams per liter, but when they get up to 1,500 milligrams per liter, then it becomes a violation. And you have to be careful about that. Some of it, like Memphis has their BOD limit that they allow for all their industries. If every industry that they have in their program actually discharge that allows permit limit, their plant will be wiped out. So fortunately that they don't have that problem, but we're going to correct their limits as well. Typical pollutants that you see surcharges applied to, the conventional pollutants, start to see nutrients in there. Also flow, occasionally you'll see industry a lot of them that will limit flow and permit, and occasionally you'll see them putting surcharge rates on them as well. And here's just an example calculation where you have a surcharge threshold, and I refer to as surcharge limits all the time when I'm talking about this, but they're really not limits. It is a threshold. That anything above 300 milligrams per liter, the city's going to start charging 12 cents a pound for any excess waste above that level. And say you've got an industry and their average concentration is 985 milligrams per liter, and this is their flow. So, you take the difference in their measured concentration and the surcharge threshold, and you basically multiply the flow, the conversion factor, convert it to pounds, and then the surcharge rate is 12 cents per pound, and that gives you basically $2,400 in surcharge fees that this industry is paying. And again, that's fine as long as the wastewater plant can handle waste. But it's a good revenue system for municipalities. So this is the easy one to get cities to use, surcharge rate. Getting them to collect permit fees and inspection fees is a story necessary. But this is a study that we did about just under 40 POTWs in Region 4, just to get average surcharge rates among facilities for different parameters, and then here's the average concentration for which they were starting surcharges. And it's just some ballpark numbers for you to use, share with some of your municipalities. And then also permit fees. We were at City of Los Angeles last week. They have a permit application fee. When I first started putting this information together, their permit application fee was $340. It's now gone up to $400, and it's just for the application. After they get the permit, once they get the permit, they have additional fees, and they do get their money back on their Pretreat Prog because they charge for inspections and sampling and data collection and alternatives and so forth. But this is just typically the range you see for permit. And you may have higher permit fees depending on the type of industry. Categorical industries may have a higher permit fee simply because it takes more time to write that permit. There's more time involved in ensuring that they're in compliance. And those are the sort of things that you have to take into consideration. And typically when we see these higher range permit fees, that's not a one-time payment. They spread that cost out over 5 years or 3 years or whatever the life of that permit is. I already talked about this, but again, they may have different fees for restaurants or commercial facilities. And some charge for, if they permit their industry, they have a fog program, and they might have a permit fee, like I said, the average annual cost of $120. A lot of cities are recouping those costs, but we've got data to show how people can do that and example fees that they can apply. And also, we don't see a lot of people who have line item sampling costs that they dole out to their industry that's typically absorbed into their permit fees. But they want to make sure that they're recouping for the people that are going out and collecting the samples and for the analytical costs that they're incurring as well. And then also the same thing with inspection fees. For the most part, they're absorbed into the permit fees, but the emphasis again is helping cities to understand that they don't need to be losing money for this. EPA doesn't expect them to lose money running a procurement program. The benefit of running the program outweighs losing money. So, again, if you have maintenance costs, if you've got blockages as a result of oil and grease, and you have to go out and clean out sewers, then they need to recoup the cost of that. That's why it's important we tell cities to go back and track down who caused that blockage, who was the guilty party, so that you can put all that maintenance cost back on them. As well as, you know, if you've got donut places are terrible about the corrosion, high corrosion discharges, and we have another presentation we do on sampling that has a lot of really nasty pictures. We might show that next time about the corrosion from these various types of restaurants. But you know, and the big picture is you have all these maintenance costs that you incur, and you want to recoup that. In the last few slides here, I don't know how many of you remember the performance measures. It popped up 5 or 6 years ago, and EPA was really pushing us toward developing performance measures to evaluate pretreatment programs. Some of it was based on, are they meeting the prohibitive standards that they had against flooding explosions that they had in the last decade? And it all was generated out of that Office of Inspector General report that Amelia referenced earlier, where they were trying to figure out what is the how effective is the pretreatment program, basically. Are they meeting some of these? So we tried to come up with these tools so that you could measure the success of a pretreatment program. You know, so are they eliminating the potential for hazardous discharges? And you know, we had a very experienced, I think he had about 20 years in the wastewater field in East Tennessee. A guy was collecting samples, and he was going down into Manhole to get pH readings, and he went down and got a reading. He came back up to tell it to his partners that he could record it, and he decided he'd get out. He decided he'd go back and take one more reading, and he passed out. And his coworker, you know, couldn't reach him, so he goes to the truck to call for help. And by the time he gets back to Manhole, the guy's been washed down, and you know, didn't survive. You know, and so you want to control those hazardous atmospheres. There's definitely potential for serious damage. We've had a couple in the last 5 years, a couple of deaths in Tennessee from experienced people who were not using adequate precaution. Then they were exposed to some exhausting fumes. So you have to be careful about that. And we want to make sure if you can show that you're controlling that. If you have observed pH problems where you've had corrosion, I mentioned one of the facilities earlier, the GM facility, is having that issue with corrosion. How well are cities controlling that? That's going to be a measure of how effective the pretreatment program is. If historically they had problems and they have it in the last 5 years, that's showing signs of improvement. The pretreatment program is working. Are they eliminating SSOs? SSOs has been a focus of EPA over the last 5 or 6 years. So how well are they eliminating those in their system? And eliminating interference and pass-through, which we told you is the 2 primary goals of the pretreatment program. And then on the flip side, what are they preventing? What are they doing from a more positive standpoint? Are all the permits that they have correct? Are they identifying industrial user categories correctly? Do they have all the correct tools in the permits? How many industries are in full compliance? And that's one of the things that we've been tracking, particularly for Region 9 in the last 5 or 6 years. How many industries are 100% compliant? And that helps us show headquarters that the pretreatment program is an effective tool and needs to continue to be funded. And that's why it's important to put together that information. And then, you know, how many of them are able to generate high-quality biosolids and for reuse. And then, you know, as of late, we've really been looking at emerging pollutants and the impact that they have, and there's several studies that EPA is working on now to figure out what those are. But any cities that are working above and beyond, you know, the larger cities, of course, have the manpower to do that stuff. I remember years ago, LA County, they were doing a lindane study and eliminating lindane was typically found in fleet. Lice treatment, and so they were eliminating that from their sewer system because they had this public education, stay away from lindane program. So anybody who's doing that, documenting that kind of stuff, sort of evaluates how well the procurement program is doing, and that's one of the bigger focuses now that EPA has. And then here's just that table of the different performance measures and the benefits that you have from each of these. And I think this is a good public education tool as well. And it's just something for you guys to share with your municipalities, I think. That's it. Well, Leah's back in the corner.
I don't want to walk in front of the
any questions about anything all day long? Yes.
So is changing like the fee structure considered like a minor modification? Like they don't need to come to the approval authority every single time that we want to change.
I wouldn't consider changing the fee structure a substantial modification.
No, I wouldn't either, but they need to notify the approval authority of any modification, whether it's substantial or non-substantial. Yeah, they have to do that regardless.
Yeah, and it's, but they don't have to have approval before prior to anything.
And they should report that in the annual report.
Yeah, that's more of an infrastructure issue, and they may want to do a public notification or meet with your industry and say, hey, guess what, you were paying $10 a year for your permit, and you're now going to pay $1,500. They might want to know that, but no, it's not substantial. Anything else? Yes.
Just kind of a follow-up question on the pretreatment facility that was a categorical user that essentially had a zero discharge standard. If there's a facility which is generating categorical waste, but they're not discharging that categorical waste, and they're discharging other ancillary wastewaters, do they still need a permit?
They do, because those ancillary wastewaters are covered under the regulation.
Okay.
Yeah. And there's a difference in ancillary wastewaters and unregulated wastewaters.
Okay.
The ancillary wastewaters, for example, the 40 that I went and reviewed in the metal finishing, those are ancillary streams that are also regulated under the categorical standard. And some of the other categorical standards identify those as well. Aluminum forming spells those out. But that's different from those are regulated streams. If it's a facility that's a categorical industry and they have no discharge of that categorical waste, but they have other processed waste, which are unregulated, that they discharge, that's totally different.
Okay.
Well, so then they would be not regulated.
Well, and that varies with each EPA region.
Whether they would get a
Based on
permit?
national consistency.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the answer would be, depends on a lot of factors.
Yeah.
It's not that simple of an answer.
It would be great if it was, and this first came up in one of the national EPA meetings, and the theme of that meeting was national consistency, and I listened to 2 EPA regions argue back and forth for about an hour about how to regulate these types of facilities. Well, so much for national consistency. But
We're consistent. Each region does it different.
yeah, they're consistent within the region. Yeah.
No, they're consistently inconsistent between regions.
Yeah. But and again, it would depend on what that waste stream is and how a lot of it comes down to how comfortable the municipality is with trusting that industry for the proper disposal of that categorical waste. Is there any likelihood that they might decide one day we're going to dump it down the drain? Those are the kind of things I would take into consideration as far as whether I'm permitting them and how I'm classifying them.
Yeah, I think that's consistent. It has to deal with the potential discharge.
Yeah.
Categorical wastewater down there.
Any other questions?